2 days before my due date, my husband's ex sent him a frantic text about an emergency. He told me to handle things on my own and disappeared for a week. When he finally came back, he was stunned to find his mom at our house with some papers. I'm in a very complicated situation and would appreciate any advice. My husband, Jeremy, 35M, and I, 32F, have been together for 5 years, married for 2. We met through work, so I didn't know much about his past initially. Eventually, I learned that we both had only had one serious relationship post-college. My ex and I had dated for 4 years, 3 during college and 1 year after, but we broke up due to personal differences and lost touch. We had been broken up for almost 5 years when I met Jeremy. However, Jeremy was still in touch with his ex when we started dating and was actually pretty good friends with her. His ex, let's call her Valerie, was his high school sweetheart. They had been together since they were 16, right through college, and had been broken up for 5 years when he met me. He told me they had parted ways because she wanted to advance her career with a job in Australia, and he didn't want a long-distance relationship. They tried to make it work for a few months, but eventually mutually agreed to part ways since it was for the best. They were part of the same circle, so they continued to stay in touch and remain friends. I was fine with it until I met his group of friends for the first time after almost 9 months of dating. All of them got together for dinner on New Year's Eve, and Jeremy decided to take me along to introduce me to his friends. Valerie was there as well, which surprised me since I hadn't been prepared to see her. Jeremy had only said nice things about her, so initially, I wasn't insecure. But as soon as I started interacting with her, I realized her energy was very different from what I had expected. Jeremy had made her sound warm and relaxed, but she wasn't like that at all. She made some really cutting remarks about me in front of everyone, and everyone just laughed it off because apparently, that was her sense of humor. But I didn't like it one bit. Nobody seemed to get it because she disguised her comments as jokes, like how she remarked that I looked different in person than in pictures and how she wasn't sure if I was Jeremy's type since he preferred tall blondes and I was neither, but she was, and everybody laughed since they thought she was just joking. She also made some remarks about how I was her successor, so she felt like she owed it to me to give me some training on how to keep Jeremy happy. These remarks were still somewhat harmless, and I was willing to look past them, thinking she might just have a very weird sense of humor. But then, while we were drinking, she toasted the fact that Jeremy had finally moved on and how happy she was for him. I thought that was nice until she added that had it not been for her decision to move to Australia, I probably wouldn't even be there with them. Thankfully, nobody laughed because it was awkward, but she quickly started laughing at her own comment, forcing everyone to chuckle to move past it. It wasn't lost on me that she was still possessive about Jeremy. Once we got back home, I told him I didn't want her speaking to me again. He wanted to be with me. I told him I was uncomfortable with his friendship with her since she was clearly not over him and had been rude to me the entire evening. I had put up with her respectfully once, but I wasn't going to do it again. I was very clear about my boundaries because even in my earlier relationships, I had to deal with similar issues. Thankfully, Jeremy seemed to understand where I was coming from. He told me he also found her behavior strange and decided he would cut her out of his life because he didn't want her causing issues in our relationship. After that incident, I never heard him mention Valerie or speak to her again. He told me he had blocked her, so I was content with that explanation. I met his friends several times after that, and they never brought up Valerie with me, probably because Jeremy had told them I didn't like her. Things had been going smoothly until last week. I was pregnant, and last Sunday was my due date. It's Thursday now, and Jeremy left to attend to Valerie because she had some emergency and needed him by her side. He left 2 days before my due date and came back last night. We had a massive argument about it because I had assumed he had blocked Valerie and wasn't in touch with her. He told me he had indeed blocked her, but she had used a different number to contact him and was pretty desperate. Apparently, she had been diagnosed with stage 2 brain cancer and really needed someone to be there for her. I was furious with him. How could he leave me alone when I was so heavily pregnant? I understood that it was difficult for him to accept that someone he used to be close to might not make it, but it wasn't as if she was going to pass away immediately. He could have gone the next day after being there for me during the labor and seeing his child born, but as soon as he got the news, he had to leave immediately. I tried to explain how ridiculous it was for him to even consider leaving me in this condition, but he insisted he'd be back before I went into labor, saying due dates aren't accurate and I might still have another week. He told me to just deal with it until he returned, then left for the airport without even finishing our conversation. He knew I didn't have my family here. My parents lived in the UAE, and I was completely relying on him. After he left for the airport, I tried calling him several times, but his phone was switched off. Desperate and upset, I called my mother-in-law, who had always been nice to me. Through tears, I explained the situation, and she came right over, trying to call him as well, but of course, his phone remained off. She comforted me and stayed with me all day because I was extremely upset and kept crying, with the pregnancy hormones amplifying my emotions. We couldn't reach Jeremy until the next day, and even then, he didn't answer our calls. He only sent us both a text saying he would be back soon, hopefully before the baby was born. He apologized and said he would accept any punishment I deemed fit when he returned, but for now, he had to be there for an old friend who had no family in Australia and whose parents couldn't fly out due to her father's illness. She was counting on him to help her process this news, and he just had to be there. His explanation did nothing to calm me and only made me angrier. He thought it was more important to be there for an old friend than for his pregnant wife. A cancer diagnosis is serious, but what could he do about it? Cure her instantly? No. He should have stayed with me. My mother-in-law agreed and asked me bluntly if I wanted to leave him. Without much thought, I said yes. She spoke to her lawyer and had him draw up divorce papers and an agreement to terminate Jeremy's parental rights. She told me that if he came back before the due date, I could decide whether to file for divorce or talk to him first. If he didn't make it back in time, it would be clear what I had to do. Having raised Jeremy as a single parent, she understood the struggle and was determined to ensure I wouldn't go through the same thing. She promised Jeremy would pay child support. Unlike his father, who abandoned them, she stayed with me throughout the week, offering support. For the next few days, neither of us contacted Jeremy. On Monday, I went into labor. My mother-in-law tried calling Jeremy to let him know, but he didn't pick up. She decided not to text him because there was no point. Fortunately, my parents had flown in the day before, so they were there for me. Still, I felt Jeremy's absence acutely. I made up my mind that no matter what happened when he came back, I would never see him the same way again. 3 hours after giving birth, I filled out the paperwork for the divorce and told the lawyer to file it on my behalf. One of my friends had advised me that if I wanted to be happy and be a good mother to my child, I had to take care of myself first. I couldn't do that with a man who prioritized his obligations to Valerie over me. After our daughter was born, I didn't even call Jeremy. My mother-in-law, my parents, and I stayed at home together. My parents were supposed to leave tomorrow, so it would just be me and my mother-in-law. I told them all about my decision to leave him because he hadn't tried to contact me despite promising to be back before the due date. He had spent a week with Valerie instead. Last night, Jeremy came home late. I opened the door, and he hugged me, but I shook him off and said I wanted nothing to do with him. Hearing the doorbell and the commotion, my mother-in-law walked into the room with the papers and threw them in his face. She demanded he leave immediately. She didn't care where he spent the night, she wanted him out of the house because I needed peace and quiet after giving birth. She also told him I had already filled out the divorce paperwork and needed him to complete the paperwork to terminate his parental rights. Jeremy was shocked and speechless for a few minutes. I left the room because I was still weak and needed to recover. Seeing him had weakened my resolve. Then I heard yelling and realized Jeremy was fighting with his mother. I stayed out of it, comforting my daughter. After a few minutes, Jeremy started calling my name, demanding to see me. My mother-in-law told him to leave and let me rest because I didn't want to see him, but he kept insisting. When I came out, he looked devastated. He begged me to reconsider because we had built a life together and I couldn't throw it away over one mistake. He acknowledged how selfish and irresponsible his actions were, but he couldn't help himself since he felt Valerie had nobody else. He thought he would be back before the due date and had called Valerie's friends to ensure she had someone to look after her. He couldn't contact me because Valerie had a bad breakdown and had gone to the hospital, so he was waiting for her. He had already booked his return ticket when he got my mother-in-law's text saying I was in labor. He apologized, saying his phone had run out of battery, so he couldn't get in touch until he reached home. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to believe him and give him another chance because I love him, but I can't get past the fact that he left me alone at the most critical time. I don't think he will do this again, but I can't be sure. I told him to leave, saying I needed time to think. He went to stay with his friend. My parents have been supportive, and my mother-in-law, though not legally bound to help, has been extremely kind and promised to help me as much as possible if I go through with the divorce. I have a few days to decide whether to file for divorce. Am I overreacting to a situation he couldn't help? Or was his decision to leave at such a critical time a red flag? I don't know what to do.